The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of Windsor Castle as Charles stood at the tall windows of his private study. His fingers drummed nervously against the windowsill while he watched Kate walking along the rose garden path below. She moved with the grace that had first caught William's attention years ago, but today her shoulders seemed to carry the weight of the entire monarchy. Kate paused near the fountain, her hand resting on the stone edge as she gazed into the clear water. The morning light caught the auburn highlights in her hair, and Charles found himself remembering how different things had been just a year ago. Back then, the family gatherings were filled with laughter, William and Kate's children running through these same gardens while Harry and Meghan visited with their own little ones. Now, the silence felt deafening. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. "Your Majesty," came the voice of his private secretary. "The Duchess of Cambridge has requested a private audience." Charles turned from the window, straightening his tie. "Send her in immediately." Kate entered the study with quiet dignity, closing the heavy oak door behind her. She wore a simple navy dress that somehow made her look both approachable and regal. Her eyes, usually bright with warmth, held a sadness that Charles recognized all too well. "Thank you for seeing me," Kate said, settling into the chair across from Charles's desk. "I know how busy you are with the coronation preparations." Charles waved dismissively. "Nonsense. Your family, Catherine. You always will be." He studied her face carefully. "But I can see something's troubling you." "Is it, William?" Kate's composure wavered for just a moment. "In part, yes. But it's more complicated than that." She took a deep breath. "Charles, I need to tell you something that might change everything between our families." The gravity in her voice made Charles lean forward. In all the years he'd known Kate, through scandals and celebrations, he'd never heard her sound so uncertain. "William doesn't know I'm here," Kate continued, "and I'm not sure he'd approve of what I'm about to share with you." Charles felt a familiar knot forming in his stomach. "Catherine, whatever it is, we can work through it. This family has survived much worse storms." Kate's laugh held no humor. "Has it, though? Because I'm not sure we're surviving this one." She reached into her handbag and pulled out a folded letter, her hands trembling slightly. 3 weeks ago, I received this. It was delivered to Kensington Palace by courier, but there was no return address." Charles accepted the letter, noting how Kate's fingers lingered on the paper as if reluctant to let it go. The stationery was expensive, cream-colored with a subtle watermark he recognized immediately. "It's from Camilla," Kate said quietly. "But not the Camilla you think you know." Charles's blood ran cold as he unfolded the letter. Camilla's distinctive handwriting filled the page, but the words seemed to belong to a stranger. "My dear Catherine, by the time you read this, I hope you'll understand that everything I'm about to tell you comes from a place of necessity, not malice. Charles has always been weak when it comes to matters of the heart, and I fear his sentimentality will be the downfall of this monarchy. I know about your conversations with the American producers. I know about the documentary they've proposed, and I know you're considering it as a way to tell your side of the story. What you don't know is that I've been feeding them information for months. The narrative they're planning will paint Charles as an ineffective king and William as unprepared for the throne. You and your children will be portrayed as the victims of an outdated system that chews up innocent people for the entertainment of the masses. This cannot happen, Catherine. The monarchy is bigger than any one person's pain or desire for vindication. I've worked too hard to see it all crumble now. Meet me at the cottage in Gloucestershire this Friday at 2 p.m. Come alone, and tell no one about this letter. If you don't come, I'll assume you've chosen to proceed with your plans, and I'll be forced to take more drastic measures. Yours in service to the crown." Camilla. Charles read the letter twice, his hands shaking by the second reading. When he finally looked up, Kate was watching him with a mixture of fear and determination. "I never told you about the documentary," Kate said. "I never told anyone except William, and only because they'd already approached him first." "What documentary?" Charles's voice was barely above a whisper. Kate stood and walked to the window where Charles had been standing moments earlier. "After everything that happened with Harry and Meghan, after all the attacks on our family in the press, William and I thought about telling our story. Not for money or attention, but to set the record straight about what really goes on behind these walls." She turned back to face Charles. "The producers assured us we'd have complete editorial control. It would be dignified, factual, and it would show the world that we're not the cold, calculating people they think we are." Charles felt the room spinning slightly. "And Camilla knew about this how?" "That's what terrifies me," Kate said. Because the only people who knew were William, myself, and the producers. We signed confidentiality agreements. We hadn't even made a final decision. The implications hit Charles like a physical blow. If Camilla had inside information about William and Kate's private discussions, it meant she had sources everywhere. It meant the woman he'd married, the woman he'd fought for decades to have accepted by the public, had been playing a much deeper game than he'd ever imagined. "Did you go to Gloucestershire?" Charles asked, though he dreaded the answer. Kate nodded. "I had to know what she was planning. And what I found there changed everything I thought I knew about your wife." Charles closed his eyes, feeling older than his 74 years. "Tell me." Kate returned to her chair, but instead of sitting, she gripped the back of it. "The cottage wasn't what I expected. It was like a war room, Charles. There were photographs covering every surface. Pictures of me, of William, of the children. Some taken with telephoto lenses from distances that should have been impossible to achieve." She paused, collecting herself. There were financial records, phone logs, even medical information. Camilla had been building files on everyone in the family for years. "That's impossible," Charles said. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew they weren't true. Camilla had always been remarkably well-informed about family matters. He'd attributed it to her natural curiosity and her network of friends, but now he was seeing it in a completely different light. "She was waiting for me in the garden," Kate continued. "She looked so normal, so much like the woman who's been kind to me at family dinners for years. But when she started talking, it was like listening to a complete stranger." Kate's voice grew quieter. "She told me that she'd spent the last 5 years positioning herself as the real power behind the throne. That Charles was too nostalgic and William too idealistic to understand what the monarchy needed in the modern world." Charles felt sick. "What did she want from you?" "She wanted me to convince William to step back from public duties, to focus on being a father, and let her guide the transition to Charles's reign without interference." Kate's knuckles were white where she gripped the chair. "She said if I didn't cooperate, she'd release information that would destroy William's reputation and mine." "What kind of information?" Kate looked directly at Charles, her eyes filled with a pain he'd never seen there before. "She has photographs of me from my university days. Private moments with William before we were engaged. Things that were stolen from my personal belongings years ago." Charles felt a rage building in his chest that he hadn't experienced since Diana's death. "She's been blackmailing you?" "Not blackmailing exactly. She called it insurance. She said every successful queen consort in history had to be willing to do whatever necessary to protect the institution." Kate's voice broke slightly. "She said I'd understand when I was in her position someday." The room fell silent except for the ticking of the antique clock on Charles's desk. Outside, life continued as normal, but inside the study, everything had changed. "Catherine," Charles said finally, "I need you to know that I had no idea about any of this." Kate studied his face for a long moment. "I believe you. But, Charles, there's more." Charles wasn't sure he could handle more, but he nodded for her to continue. "She's been feeding information to the press about Harry and Meghan. Some of the stories that came out after they left weren't leaks from palace staff or unnamed sources. They came directly from Camilla." Charles felt the blood drain from his face. Harry's angry phone calls, Meghan's tears during their last family gathering, the way his younger son had looked at him with such disappointment. It all made horrible sense now. "She told you this?" Kate shook her head. "She showed me. She has recordings of phone calls with reporters, copies of emails. She's been orchestrating a campaign to make sure Harry and Meghan could never come back, even if they wanted to." Charles stood abruptly, pacing to the fireplace. "Why are you telling me this now? What's changed?" Kate followed him, and, for the first time since entering the room, she looked hopeful. "Because yesterday, William and I made our decision about the documentary. We're going to do it, but not the way Camilla thinks." She pulled out her phone and showed Charles a text message. "The producers have agreed to focus the documentary on the positive work the family does. No personal drama, no behind-the-scenes conflict. Just an honest look at the day-to-day reality of serving the country." Charles looked at the message, then back at Kate. "And you think this will force Camilla's hand?" "I think she's been planning something much bigger than we realized. The documentary was just one piece of it." Kate put her hand on Charles's arm. "Charles, I think she's been positioning herself to rule through you. And when that becomes impossible, to rule through William and me." The grandfather clock in the corner began to chime noon, its deep tones echoing through the study. Charles counted each strike, using the time to process everything Kate had told him. "What do you need from me?" he asked finally. Kate smiled for the first time since entering the room. I need you to trust me, and I need you to be prepared for what's coming next. Which is, tonight is the state dinner for the Prime Minister of Canada. Camilla will expect me to behave as if nothing has changed. But, William and I have planned something that will make it clear we're not under her control anymore. Charles felt a mix of pride and terror. Kate had always been stronger than people gave her credit for, but taking on Camilla directly was dangerous territory. Catherine, please be careful. If she's capable of what you've described, there's no telling how she might react if she feels cornered. Kate squeezed his arm gently. That's why I needed to tell you everything first. Because after tonight, she's going to come to you. She's going to try to convince you that William and I are the problem, that we're threatening the stability of the monarchy. And what should I tell her? Kate's smile grew wider. Tell her the truth. Tell her that the monarchy belongs to the people, not to her. And tell her that if she wants a fight, the Windsors are ready to give her one. As Kate prepared to leave, Charles caught her hand. Catherine, whatever happens tonight, know that you have my complete support. William chose well when he chose you. Kate's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. Thank you, Charles. That means more to me than you know. After Kate left, Charles remained in his study, staring at Camilla's letter. Outside, the afternoon shadows were growing longer, and somewhere in the castle, his wife was probably preparing for the evening's event, unaware that her carefully constructed world was about to come crashing down. Charles thought about all the years he'd waited to be king, all the sacrifices he'd made, all the compromises he'd accepted. He'd convinced himself that Camilla's ambition was an asset, that her understanding of power dynamics would help him be a better monarch. Now he realized he'd been living with a stranger who'd been manipulating his family from the shadows. The woman he'd fought for, the woman he'd married despite public opposition, had been playing a game he'd never even known existed. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent decades trying to prove that Camilla deserved to be queen consort, and now he might have to choose between his wife and his crown. As the sun began to set over Windsor Castle, Charles made his decision. The monarchy had survived Henry VIII. It had survived Edward VIII's abdication. It had survived Diana's death and the scandals that followed. It would survive this too, but only if he had the courage to put the institution above his personal feelings. Tonight would change everything. And, for the first time in months, Charles felt ready for the fight that was coming. The state dining room at Buckingham Palace gleamed under the light of 6 magnificent crystal chandeliers. Each piece of silverware had been polished to perfection, each flower arrangement positioned with military precision. The Canadian Prime Minister and his wife would arrive within the hour, along with 50 other distinguished guests, but Charles could barely focus on the diplomatic importance of the evening. He stood before his bedroom mirror, adjusting his white tie for the 3rd time while his valet waited patiently nearby. Every few minutes, Charles found his eyes drifting to the door that connected his chambers to Camilla's. She'd been unusually quiet during their brief conversation earlier, mentioning only that she had some last-minute preparations to handle. Your Majesty, his valet said gently. Perhaps the diamond cufflinks instead of the sapphire ones. Charles nodded absently, his mind replaying every moment of his conversation with Kate. The letter, the photographs, the recordings, it all seemed too calculated to be the work of the woman he'd shared breakfast with that morning. Yet the evidence was undeniable. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Charles. Camilla's voice carried through the door. May I come in? Charles straightened his shoulders. Of course. Camilla entered wearing an elegant navy gown with the Queen Mother's sapphire parure. She looked every inch the Queen Consort, regal and confident. But now Charles found himself studying her expression, searching for signs of the manipulator Kate had described. You look worried, Camilla said, approaching him with a smile. The Canadians aren't that intimidating, are they? Charles managed a weak laugh. Just the usual pre-dinner nerves. Camilla reached up to adjust his tie, a gesture she'd performed countless times during their marriage. Her touch felt different now, calculated rather than affectionate. I had the most interesting conversation with my secretary today. Apparently, Catherine has been making some rather unusual requests. Charles kept his expression neutral. Oh, she wanted to know about seating arrangements for the next few months of events. Specifically, she wanted to ensure she'd be seated next to you rather than with the other wives. Camilla's fingers lingered on Charles's lapel. I found that curious, don't you? Catherine has always taken her duties seriously. Perhaps she wants to be more involved in the diplomatic conversations. Camilla stepped back, tilting her head slightly. Perhaps. Or perhaps she's positioning herself for something more significant. The way she said it sent chills down Charles's spine. It was the same tone Kate had described from their meeting at the cottage, pleasant on the surface but carrying an unmistakable threat underneath. "Camilla," Charles said carefully, "is there something specific you're concerned about?" Before she could answer, another knock came at the door. This time it was Charles's private secretary. "Your Majesty, their Royal Highnesses the Prince and Princess of Wales have arrived." Charles felt his pulse quicken. "We'll be down momentarily." After the secretary left, Camilla moved to her jewelry box, selecting a pair of diamond earrings. "You know, Charles, I've been thinking about our conversation last week regarding William's role in the coronation ceremony." Charles hadn't been planning to bring this up yet, but Camilla seemed determined to force the issue. "What about it? I think we should reconsider giving him such a prominent position. The optics might suggest that we're rushing toward the next generation before you've had a proper chance to establish yourself as king." Charles watched Camilla in the mirror as she fastened her earrings. Her movements were precise, practiced, but there was something mechanical about them. William is the heir to the throne. It's traditional for him to have a significant role. Tradition can be adapted when circumstances require it, Camilla said smoothly. And recent circumstances suggest that William and Catherine might benefit from stepping back from the spotlight for a while. "What circumstances?" Camilla turned to face him directly. "Charles, surely you've noticed the change in them over the past few months. They seem stressed, overwhelmed. Perhaps they need time to focus on their family without the pressure of royal duties." Charles felt a surge of anger, but forced himself to remain calm. This was exactly what Kate had warned him about. Camilla would try to isolate William and Catherine, making them appear unsuitable for their roles. "I think they're handling their responsibilities admirably," Charles said. "Of course you do. You see the best in everyone." Camilla's smile was indulgent, the way one might smile at a naive child. "But sometimes a king needs to make difficult decisions for the good of the institution." Charles studied his wife's reflection in the mirror. "And you think removing William from the coronation would be good for the institution?" "I think ensuring a smooth transition is paramount. And that means not giving the press or the public any reason to question your authority by appearing to share power with the younger generation." There it was, the argument Kate had predicted. Camilla wasn't just trying to sideline William and Catherine. She was positioning herself as Charles's primary advisor, the voice of wisdom guiding his reign. Charles turned to face her directly. "Camilla, I appreciate your concern, but I think William's involvement in the coronation will strengthen rather than weaken the monarchy." For just a moment, something flickered across Camilla's face, surprise, perhaps, or annoyance. But it was gone so quickly that Charles almost thought he'd imagined it. "Well," she said, "I suppose we can discuss it more later. We should head downstairs." The walk to the state dining room felt longer than usual. Charles found himself hyper-aware of Camilla beside him, noting how she nodded to staff members, how she seemed to catalog who was present and who was absent. Had she always been this observant, or was he only noticing it now? William and Kate were waiting in the receiving room, both looking impeccable in their formal attire. Kate wore a stunning emerald gown that brought out her eyes, while William stood tall in his naval uniform. They looked every inch the future king and queen, but Charles could see the tension in their carefully composed expressions. "Good evening," Charles said, embracing them both. When he hugged Kate, she whispered almost inaudibly, "Are you ready?" Charles gave an imperceptible nod, then stepped back to greet the other family members who had assembled for the evening. His brothers, Princess, and a handful of cousins all mingled in the elegant space. But Charles noticed that conversation seemed more strained than usual. Camilla moved through the group with practiced ease, greeting everyone warmly. To an outside observer, she was the perfect queen consort, gracious, dignified, and charming. But Charles found himself wondering how much of it was performance. "Your Majesty," the equerry announced, "the Prime Minister of Canada and Mrs. Morrison have arrived." Charles straightened his shoulders and prepared to fulfill his role as host. The next 2 hours would test not only his diplomatic skills, but his ability to maintain the facade of family unity while everything he thought he knew about his marriage was crumbling around him. The Prime Minister, a tall man with silver hair and an easy smile, proved to be an engaging conversationalist. His wife, a former journalist, was equally charming. But even as Charles went through the motions of diplomatic small talk, part of his attention remained on the family dynamics playing out around him. He noticed how Camilla positioned herself near William during the reception, engaging him in conversation that seemed pleasant enough on the surface. But William's responses were carefully neutral, and he kept glancing toward Kate as if seeking support. Kate, meanwhile, was speaking with the Canadian Prime Minister's wife about children's charities, her passion for the subject evident in every word. She seemed genuinely relaxed for the first time in weeks, and Charles realized how much stress she must have been under while keeping Camilla's secrets. When it came time to move into the dining room, Charles observed the seating arrangements with new interest. Camilla had indeed placed Kate next to him, just as she'd mentioned earlier. But she'd also positioned herself across from Kate, where she could monitor every conversation. The dinner conversation flowed smoothly through the usual topics: trade relations, climate change, the Commonwealth. Charles found himself admiring the Canadian Prime Minister's wit and intelligence, but he was increasingly aware of the undercurrents of tension at his own table. It was during the third course that things began to shift. The Prime Minister's wife was discussing Canada's approach to mental health initiatives when Kate spoke up. "That's fascinating," Kate said. "William and I have been discussing the possibility of expanding our mental health work internationally. We've been considering a documentary project that would showcase how different countries are addressing these challenges." Charles felt the atmosphere at the table change subtly. Camilla's fork paused halfway to her mouth, and her eyes locked onto Kate's face. "A documentary sounds wonderful," the Prime Minister's wife said enthusiastically. "Would this be something that might include Canadian perspectives?" William joined the conversation smoothly. "Absolutely. We're looking at creating something that would be truly global in scope, not just about the royal family's work, but about real people making a difference in communities around the world." Charles watched Camilla carefully. Her expression remained pleasant, but he could see the slight tightness around her eyes that indicated she was calculating rapidly. "How exciting," Camilla said. "I wasn't aware you'd moved forward with that idea." Kate smiled innocently. "Oh, we've been developing it for months. Haven't we, William? The production team has been wonderful to work with. Very discreet, very professional." Charles realized this was the moment Kate had warned him about. She was letting Camilla know that the documentary was moving forward despite all attempts to stop it. "And when might we expect to see this documentary?" the Prime Minister asked. "Early next year," Williams said. "We want to time it with some major mental health awareness campaigns we're planning." Charles noticed that several other conversations around the table had quieted as people began listening to this exchange. Royal documentaries were always newsworthy, and everyone present understood the significance of such an announcement. "I'm sure it will be fascinating," Camilla said, her voice carrying just a hint of an edge. "Though I do hope you've considered how such a project might fit with the broader communication strategy for the coronation year." Kate's smile never wavered. "Oh, we have. In fact, we've been coordinating closely with all the relevant departments to make sure everything aligns perfectly." Charles recognized the gauntlet being thrown down. Kate was making it clear that she and William had the institutional support necessary to move forward, regardless of Camilla's preferences. The conversation moved on to other topics, but Charles could feel the electricity in the air. Camilla continued to play her part perfectly, but he caught her glancing at her watch several times during the remainder of the meal. After dinner, as the group moved to the drawing room for coffee and liqueurs, Charles found himself momentarily alone with William. "That was well played," Charles said quietly. William's jaw was tight. "She cornered Kate, father. She threatened our children's privacy. That crosses every line." Charles nodded. "What happens now?" "Now we wait to see how she responds. But Catherine was right. We couldn't let this continue. Too many people have been hurt already." Before Charles could respond, Camilla appeared at his elbow. "Charles, might I have a word with you privately?" Charles felt William tense beside him. "Of course. William, would you excuse us?" As Charles followed Camilla to a quiet corner of the drawing room, he prepared himself for the conversation he'd been dreading all evening. The diplomatic guests continued their conversations around them, unaware that the real drama of the evening was just beginning. Camilla waited until they were relatively isolated before speaking. "That was quite a performance Catherine gave at dinner." Charles kept his voice neutral. "I thought she handled herself very well." The Canadians seemed genuinely interested in the documentary project. "I'm sure they were." Camilla's tone was pleasant, but her words carried an unmistakable warning. "Though I wonder if William and Catherine have fully considered all the implications of such a public project." "What kind of implications?" Camilla glanced around to ensure they weren't being overheard. "Charles, you know I only want what's best for the monarchy. But when members of the family begin making unilateral decisions about major projects, it can create complications." Charles felt his patience wearing thin. "They're hardly making unilateral decisions." They've been developing this project carefully and professionally. Have they? Camilla's eyebrows rose slightly. Because from what I understand, they've been quite secretive about it. That doesn't sound like careful coordination to me. Charles realized this was exactly the manipulation Kate had described. Camilla was trying to make William and Kate's reasonable desire for privacy sound like dangerous secrecy. Perhaps they wanted to have something concrete to present before involving everyone in the planning stages, Charles suggested. Camilla moved closer to him, lowering her voice further. Charles, I need to tell you something, and I hope you'll listen with an open mind. Charles felt his stomach clench. I'm listening. I've been hearing rumors. Nothing I can substantiate, you understand, but rumors that suggest Catherine has been in contact with the same production company that worked on Harry and Meghan's projects. Charles kept his expression carefully neutral. And if that's true, it suggests a level of coordination that goes beyond simple documentary making. It suggests they might be planning to follow Harry and Meghan's playbook. The accusation hung in the air between them. Charles understood now why Kate had felt so cornered. Camilla was skilled at planting seeds of doubt without making direct accusations, leaving room to deny everything later while still achieving her goal of undermining trust. Camilla, Charles said carefully, I think you might be reading too much into this. William and Catherine have given no indication that they're anything other than completely committed to their roles. I hope you're right, Camilla said. But, Charles, as someone who loves you and wants to protect you, I have to ask, when was the last time you had a completely honest conversation with them about their long-term plans? Charles felt trapped. If he denied having such conversations, Camilla would use it as evidence that William and Kate were hiding things from him. If he claimed to be fully informed, she might ask for specifics he couldn't provide without revealing Kate's visit that afternoon. We communicate regularly about all family matters, he said finally. Camilla studied his face for a long moment. I'm sure you do. I just hope that when they do come to you with whatever they're really planning, you'll remember that your first duty is to the crown, not to their personal ambitions. With that, she smiled brilliantly and moved away to rejoin the other guests, leaving Charles standing alone with the full weight of her words sinking in. As the evening wound down and the Canadian delegation prepared to leave, Charles went through the motions of being a gracious host. But his mind was racing, processing everything that had happened and trying to prepare for what would come next. He caught Kate's eye across the room as she said goodbye to the Prime Minister's wife. She gave him an almost imperceptible nod, and he understood that the first battle had been won. The documentary announcement had been made public, Camilla's attempt to discredit it had failed, and the family had presented a united front. But, as Charles watched his wife charm the departing guests, he knew this was only the beginning. Camilla had revealed her hand tonight, but she was far too smart to give up easily. The real confrontation was still to come, and when it arrived, Charles would have to choose between the woman he'd loved for decades and the family he'd sworn to protect. The thought terrified him, but as he looked at William and Kate saying their goodnights to the other guests, he realized his choice had already been made. The monarchy was bigger than any one person's ambitions, even his own wife's. Tonight had been about drawing battle lines. Tomorrow, the real war would begin. Charles woke to an empty bed and the sound of rain against the palace windows. The ornate clock on his nightstand read 6:47 a.m., earlier than his usual wake-up time, but sleep had been elusive. Every time he'd closed his eyes, he'd seen Camilla's face during their conversation the night before, the calculated smile, the carefully chosen words designed to plant doubt about William and Kate's loyalty. Through the connecting door, he could hear movement in Camilla's chambers. Her morning routine was as precise as everything else about her. 20 minutes of stretching, followed by tea and the morning papers, then a call to her private secretary to review the day's schedule. Charles had always admired her discipline, but now he wondered what else she accomplished during those carefully orchestrated morning hours. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. The cottage. 9 a.m. Come alone. See? Charles stared at the message for a long moment. Camilla had never communicated with him this way before. Their schedules were coordinated through their respective offices, and they typically discussed personal matters face-to-face. The cloak-in, dagger tone felt ominous. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. Your Majesty, came his valet's voice. I have your morning tea and the papers. Thank you, James. Please come in. As his valet arranged the morning service on the small table by the window, Charles tried to focus on normal routine. But the front page of the Times made that impossible. The headline read, Wales documentary signals new direction for younger royals, with the accompanying photograph from the previous night's dinner showing William, Kate, and the Canadian Prime Minister in animated conversation. Will there be anything else, Your Majesty? James asked. Actually, yes. I'll need the car prepared for 8:30. I'll be making a private journey this morning. Shall I coordinate with Her Majesty's office? Charles hesitated. No, that won't be necessary. After James left, Charles read through the various newspaper accounts of the previous evening. Most were positive, focusing on the diplomatic success of the dinner and the intriguing announcement about William and Kate's documentary project. But he noticed that several articles quoted royal sources expressing surprise that the project hadn't been announced through official channels. Camilla's voice carried through the connecting door as she spoke on the phone with someone. Charles couldn't make out the specific words, but her tone was crisp and businesslike. He found himself wondering who she was speaking with at such an early hour. By 8:15, Charles was dressed and ready to leave. He chose his most casual attire, a simple suit and tie that wouldn't attract attention. As he prepared to slip out through his private exit, he heard Camilla's door open. Charles, she called. Are you heading out early today? Charles paused, his hand on the doorknob. Just some personal business to attend to. I see. There was a pause. Well, I hope you have a productive morning. We should talk later about last night's dinner. I have some thoughts about the Canadian trade discussions. Charles felt the familiar manipulation in her words. She was offering him a normal, business-like conversation about their royal duties, making any other interpretation of events seem paranoid or unreasonable. Of course, he replied. Perhaps this afternoon. The drive to Gloucestershire took 45 minutes through increasingly rural countryside. Charles had visited the cottage before. It was one of several properties Camilla had retained from her previous life, a charming stone building surrounded by gardens that she'd claimed was her retreat from royal duties. He'd always thought it reflected her practical, down-to-earth nature. Now he wondered what secrets it had been hiding. Camilla's car was already in the driveway when Charles arrived. Through the windows, he could see lights on throughout the house, unusual for what was supposed to be a simple country cottage. His driver offered to wait, but Charles dismissed him. Whatever was about to happen, he suspected it would take a while. Camilla opened the door before he could knock. She was dressed simply in jeans and a cashmere sweater, looking more like a country gentlewoman than a queen consort. But her expression was serious, almost grim. Thank you for coming, she said, stepping aside to let him enter. I know this is irregular, but circumstances require privacy. The interior of the cottage had been transformed since Charles's last visit. The cozy sitting room had been converted into what could only be described as a command center. Multiple laptops sat open on a large table, surrounded by phones, tablets, and stacks of documents. A wall-mounted screen displayed what appeared to be a social media monitoring dashboard, tracking mentions of various royal family members in real time. My God, Charles breathed. What is all this? Camilla closed the door behind him and engaged multiple locks. This is how modern monarchy really works, Charles. This is how we stay relevant, how we control the narrative, how we survive. Charles moved deeper into the room, taking in the scope of the operation. There were detailed files on journalists, photographers, and social media influencers. A large calendar on one wall showed upcoming royal events with notations about media coverage and public perception management. How long has this been going on, he asked. Since before our marriage, Camilla replied. Do you think the public's acceptance of me happened by accident? Do you think the positive coverage of our wedding was just good luck? Charles felt as if the ground was shifting beneath his feet. You orchestrated all of that. I orchestrated our survival, Camilla corrected. The monarchy was dying, Charles. Diana's death had damaged it almost beyond repair, and the public saw you as weak and selfish. Something had to be done. She moved to one of the laptops and pulled up a series of charts and graphs. Look at these approval ratings. When we announced our engagement, your numbers were in the low 30s. By our wedding day, they were in the 60s. That didn't happen because people suddenly forgot about Diana. Charles studied the data, recognizing the gradual shift in public opinion that had indeed occurred over those years. At the time, he'd attributed it to the natural healing power of time and his own efforts to rehabilitate his image. You've been managing my reputation without my knowledge. I've been protecting you, Camilla said firmly, and protecting the institution you'll inherit. But I can't do that if members of the family go rogue and start making unauthorized public statements. Charles felt his anger rising. You mean like William and Kate pursuing legitimate projects that showcase the monarchy's positive work. Camilla's expression hardened. I mean, like William and Kate secretly coordinating with the same production companies that helped Harry and Meghan trash the family's reputation. She pulled up another screen, this one showing email correspondence that made Charles's blood run cold. The messages were between Kate and a production executive, discussing not just the mental health documentary, but also future opportunities for expanded storytelling about the real royal family. Where did you get these? Charles demanded. That's not important. What's important is that your daughter-in-law has been playing a much deeper game than you realize. Camilla scrolled through more messages. Look at this one from last month. She's discussing a multi-year content deal that would give the production company unprecedented access to family events. Charles read the messages with growing horror. They did seem to suggest a level of commercial partnership that went well beyond a single documentary. This can't be real. I'm afraid it is. And this morning, I received confirmation that they've been in contact with streaming services about distribution rights. Camilla turned to face him directly. Charles, they're planning to monetize your crown. Charles felt dizzy. Could he have been so wrong about William and Kate's intentions? Could his own desperation to see them as innocent victims have blinded him to their real agenda? But yesterday, Catherine came to me, he said, trying to make sense of the contradictions. She told me about your letter, about the meeting here. Camilla's expression shifted to one of sympathetic concern. Charles, I never sent Catherine any letter. And this is the first time I've been to this cottage in weeks. Charles felt the world tilting. Either Camilla was lying with extraordinary skill, or Kate had fabricated the entire story about blackmail and threats. That's impossible, he said. She showed me the letter. It was in your handwriting. Camilla moved to a desk drawer and pulled out a sheet of paper. You mean this letter? Charles took the paper with shaking hands. It was indeed the letter Kate had shown him, word for word. But, as he examined it more closely, something felt wrong about the handwriting. It was close to Camilla's style, but not quite right. Charles, Camilla said gently, I think Catherine has been very clever. She knew you would believe her over me because of our history, because of your guilt about Diana. She's been playing on your emotions while setting up a financial empire. Charles slumped into a nearby chair, overwhelmed by the implications. But the photographs she mentioned, the surveillance. What photographs? Camilla asked. Charles, I think Catherine has been spinning an elaborate fiction to deflect attention from her real activities. Camilla moved to another laptop and pulled up a financial tracking program. Look at this. Over the past 6 months, significant sums have been moving through accounts connected to William and Catherine's charitable foundation. Money that doesn't correspond to any known donors or grants. The numbers on the screen were staggering. Charles had always assumed that the Wales Foundation operated on a modest scale, focused on specific charitable initiatives. But these figures suggested a much larger operation. This could be explained, Charles said weakly. Anonymous donors, planned giving. It could be, Camilla agreed. But, combined with the production company communications and yesterday's very public announcement, it suggests something else entirely. She pulled up one more screen, this one showing social media analytics. Look at the timing of their announcement last night. It wasn't coincidental. They've been building toward this moment for months, creating a narrative of independence from traditional royal constraints. Charles studied the data, seeing patterns he hadn't noticed before. The timing of various statements, the coordination with certain media outlets, the gradual building of public support for a more modern approach to royal duties. It all seemed suspiciously orchestrated. But why would they do this, he asked. They have everything they could want. Camilla sat across from him, her expression sad but determined. Because they're young, Charles. They see what Harry and Meghan achieved financially, and they think they can do it better, more subtly. They want to maintain their titles and privileges while building independent wealth. Charles felt a pain in his chest that had nothing to do with physical illness. Could his beloved son and daughter-in-law really be planning to commercialize their royal status? Could he have been so blind to their true nature? What do you propose I do? He asked finally. Camilla leaned forward. First, we need to stop the documentary. The contracts haven't been finalized yet. I've confirmed that much. We can claim concerns about timing or content and pull the plug. And then? Then, we restructure their roles. William can keep his position as heir, but we limit his public duties and remove him from any commercially sensitive activities. Catherine can focus on her children and smaller charitable patronages. Charles felt sick. You want me to sideline my own son? I want you to protect your throne, Camilla said firmly. Because if you don't act now, if you let them continue down this path, they'll destroy everything you've worked for. And when the public realizes that the future king and queen have been treating the monarchy like a business opportunity, the damage will be irreparable. Charles stood and walked to the window, looking out at the peaceful countryside. Everything seemed normal out there: sheep grazing in fields, birds flying overhead, the natural world continuing its ancient rhythms regardless of human drama. He wished desperately that he could escape into that simplicity. "I need time to think," he said. "Of course," Camilla replied. "But, Charles, time is a luxury we don't have much of. Every day they continue their planning is another day closer to a scandal that could bring down the monarchy." As Charles prepared to leave, Camilla handed him a thick folder. "These are copies of all the evidence I've gathered. Review it carefully, and you'll see that I'm right." The drive back to London was a blur of countryside and confusion. Charles's mind raced between the two incompatible stories he'd been told. Either his wife was a manipulative sociopath who had been orchestrating his life for years, or his daughter-in-law was a calculating opportunist who had been planning to exploit her royal status for financial gain. Both scenarios seemed impossible, yet the evidence for each was compelling. Camilla's documentation was thorough and detailed, while Kate's emotional appeal had seemed utterly genuine. Charles realized that one of the two women he trusted most in the world had been lying to him with extraordinary skill. Back at the palace, Charles retreated to his study and spread Camilla's evidence across his desk. The financial records, email communications, and media analysis painted a disturbing picture of calculated planning and hidden agendas. But, as he studied the materials more closely, something began to bother him. The evidence was almost too perfect, too comprehensive. How had Camilla managed to obtain private email correspondence between Kate and production companies? How had she accessed detailed financial records from the Wales Foundation? The level of surveillance and data gathering suggested resources and connections that went far beyond what any individual should possess. Charles picked up his phone to call William, then put it down again. What would he say? He couldn't accuse Kate of deception without more certainty, but he couldn't ignore the evidence Camilla had provided either. As the afternoon shadows grew longer, Charles realized he was trapped in a situation where any action he took could destroy his family. If he confronted William and Kate with Camilla's evidence, and they were innocent, he would shatter relationships that could never be repaired. If he ignored the evidence, and they were guilty, he would enable the destruction of the monarchy he'd spent his life preparing to serve. The weight of the crown had never felt heavier than it did that afternoon, sitting alone in his study while the two competing versions of reality battled in his mind. Outside, life at the palace continued as normal, but Charles knew that nothing would ever be the same again. His phone rang, startling him from his thoughts. It was his private secretary. "Your Majesty, Their Royal Highnesses the Prince and Princess of Wales have requested an audience this evening. They say it's urgent." Charles felt his stomach clench. "What time?" 7 o'clock, sir. They're currently en route from Kensington Palace." Charles looked at the clock. It was already past 5. In less than 2 hours, he would have to face William and Kate, knowing everything he now knew, or thought he knew. The confrontation he'd been dreading was finally here, and he still had no idea which version of the truth to believe. As he prepared for what might be the most important conversation of his reign, Charles realized that the next few hours would determine not just the future of his relationships with William and Kate, but the future of the monarchy itself. The stakes couldn't be higher, and he'd never felt less prepared for the challenge ahead. Charles stood at the window of his private study, watching the evening light fade over the palace gardens. The folder of evidence from Camilla sat heavy on his desk behind him, each document a potential bomb that could destroy everything he held dear. His reflection in the window glass looked older than his 74 years, the weight of impossible decisions etched in every line of his face. The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside made his pulse quicken. William and Kate had arrived, and soon he would have to choose between believing his wife or his daughter-in-law. The truth was somewhere in the maze of accusations and counter-accusations, but finding it might cost him his family. A gentle knock interrupted his thoughts. "Your Majesty," came his private secretary's voice, "Their Royal Highnesses have arrived." "Send them in," Charles said, turning from the window. William entered first, his face set in the serious expression Charles remembered from his military days. Kate followed, wearing a simple black dress that made her look both elegant and vulnerable. But there was something different about her tonight. a determined set to her shoulders that suggested she'd come prepared for battle. "Father," William said, embracing Charles briefly. "Thank you for seeing us on such short notice." "Of course," Charles replied, gesturing to the sitting area away from his desk. "Please sit down." As they settled into the familiar chairs where they'd had countless family conversations over the years, Charles felt the surreal nature of the moment. How had they gone from planning coronations and discussing grandchildren to this atmosphere of barely concealed suspicion? Kate spoke first, her voice steady despite the obvious tension. "Charles, we need to talk about what happened after we left last night." Charles felt his stomach tighten. "Oh," William leaned forward. "Camilla came to see us this morning. She had quite a story to tell about your conversation yesterday." Charles realized he was holding his breath. "What did she say?" Kate's eyes never left his face. "She told us that you'd expressed concerns about our documentary project, that you felt we were being secretive and potentially damaging to the monarchy. She also," William continued, "suggested that we might be following Harry and Meghan's example in ways that could compromise our positions." Charles felt trapped. If he confirmed Camilla's version, he would be betraying the trust Kate had placed in him the day before. If he denied it, he would be calling his wife a liar based on accusations he wasn't entirely sure he believed. "What exactly did she tell you?" he asked carefully. Kate reached into her handbag and pulled out a small device. "She told us quite a lot, actually. But, fortunately, we recorded the conversation." Charles felt the blood drain from his face. "You recorded her?" "William suggested it," Kate said. "After everything that's happened, we felt we needed protection against further manipulation." She pressed play on the device, and Camilla's voice filled the room with crystal clarity. "Charles is concerned, naturally. He feels that your recent announcements suggest a lack of coordination with the broader family strategy. He's asked me to speak with you about toning down your public profile for a while." Kate's voice responded, "That's surprising. When we spoke with him yesterday, he seemed completely supportive." "Well, you know Charles. He doesn't like confrontation, so he tells people what he thinks they want to hear. But, privately, he's been expressing serious doubts about your judgment lately." Charles listened in horror as his wife's voice continued. "He's particularly concerned about your financial arrangements with the production company. Some of the contracts you've signed raise questions about commercial exploitation of royal status." On the recording, William's voice was ice cold. "What contracts?" "We haven't signed anything beyond a preliminary agreement for the mental health documentary." "Oh dear," came Camilla's voice, dripping with false sympathy. "I'm afraid that's not what Charles has been told. He has documentation showing significant financial commitments that go well beyond a single project." Charles felt sick as he listened to his wife manipulate his children with lies presented as his own concerns. The recording continued for several more minutes, with Camilla weaving an elaborate fiction about Charles's supposed distrust of William and Kate's motives. When Kate finally turned off the device, the room fell into heavy silence. Charles stared at his hands, unable to meet their eyes. "That's not," he said finally, "that's not how I feel at all." "We know," Kate said gently. "Because we know you, Charles. And we know she's been playing us against each other for months." William stood and walked to the window. "The question is, what are we going to do about it?" Charles looked up at his son's reflection in the glass. "William, there's something I need to tell you. This morning, Camilla showed me evidence that seemed to support her claims about your commercial arrangements." Kate nodded. "The forged emails and fabricated financial records." Charles's head snapped up. "You know about those?" "We know about all of it," William said, turning back to face the room. "Charles, we've been investigating Camilla's activities for weeks. The cottage in Gloucestershire, the surveillance operation, the media manipulation. We have documentation of everything." Kate opened her handbag again and pulled out a much thicker folder than the one Camilla had given him. "We've been working with a private security firm that specializes in digital forensics. Everything Camilla showed you today was fabricated." Charles accepted the folder with trembling hands. The first document was a technical analysis of the emails Camilla had claimed were from Kate to production companies. According to the forensic report, the messages had been created using sophisticated software that could mimic writing styles and create convincing but entirely fictional correspondence. "She's been doing this for years," William explained, "creating false evidence to support whatever narrative she wants to promote. The financial records, the surveillance photos, even some of the media stories that seemed to come from palace sources, it all traces back to her operation." Charles felt overwhelmed by the implications. "But how? How could she have the resources for something this elaborate?" Kate exchanged a look with William before answering. "She's not working alone, Charles. We've identified at least 6 people in various palace departments who've been feeding her information and carrying out tasks on her behalf. Who? William pulled out a list of names. Some Charles recognized as longtime palace employees, people he'd trusted for years. Others were more recent additions to the staff, hired on Camilla's recommendation. They've been reporting on family conversations, accessing private correspondence, even monitoring our children's activities, Kate said, her voice tight with controlled anger. The level of surveillance has been extraordinary. Charles thought back to all the times Camilla had seemed remarkably well informed about family matters he thought were private. Every conversation, every decision, every moment of doubt, it had all been reported back to her. There's more, William said. We've traced financial payments from accounts connected to Camilla's operation to several journalists and photographers. She hasn't just been manipulating the family. She's been actively managing media coverage to serve her agenda. Charles looked through more of the documents, seeing a pattern of payments and communications that painted a picture of systematic manipulation. Stories that had painted him in a positive light, articles that had criticized Harry and Meghan, even some of the favorable coverage of his relationship with Camilla, all of it had been purchased. Why? Charles asked. What does she gain from all this? Kate leaned forward. Control, Charles. She's been positioning herself as the real power behind the throne. Think about it. Who has been your primary advisor on family matters? Who influences your decisions about public appearances, charitable commitments, even personal relationships? Charles realized with growing horror that Kate was right. Over the years since their marriage, Camilla had gradually become his primary sounding board for almost everything. He'd thought it was natural for a husband to rely on his wife's counsel, but now he saw it as something much more calculated. She's been isolating you from independent advice, William continued. Every time you might have turned to someone else for a second opinion, Camilla was there with reasons why they couldn't be trusted or why their advice wasn't sound. Charles thought about his relationships with his siblings, his old friends, even his private secretaries. In each case, he could remember Camilla raising subtle concerns about their reliability or judgment. Over time, he'd found himself depending almost entirely on her perspective. But the coronation, Charles said. She's been essential to the planning process. Has she? Kate asked. Or has she been micromanaging the process to ensure maximum personal visibility while limiting the roles of other family members? Charles reviewed the coronation plans in his mind, seeing them now through a different lens. Camilla had indeed advocated for a prominent role for herself, while suggesting that William's participation should be more limited. She'd argued for smaller roles for Anne and Edward, and she'd been the one to suggest that Harry shouldn't be invited at all. She's been preparing to rule through you, William said. And when that becomes impossible due to your age or health, she's been positioning herself to have significant influence over my reign as well. Charles felt a deep shame settling over him. How could he have been so blind? How had his love for Camilla made him so vulnerable to manipulation? There's something else, Kate said quietly. We think she's been planning to discredit us for months. The goal was to create a situation where you'd have to choose between your wife and your heir. If she could make you doubt our loyalty, she could justify our removal from succession planning. Removal from succession? Charles's voice was barely a whisper. William nodded grimly. She's been researching historical precedents for bypassing direct heirs in favor of more distant relatives. She's even had preliminary conversations with lawyers about what would be required to make such a change legal. The room spun around Charles as the full scope of Camilla's ambition became clear. She hadn't just been manipulating media coverage or family dynamics. She'd been planning a fundamental restructuring of the monarchy with herself at its center. We have recordings of those conversations too, Kate said, along with documentation of payments to the lawyers involved. Charles stood abruptly, pacing to his desk where Camilla's folders still lay open. All those carefully prepared documents, all that seemingly damning evidence against William and Kate, it had all been an elaborate fabrication designed to turn him against his own children. She must know you've discovered her activities, Charles said. What happens now? William and Kate exchanged another look. We think she's planning something dramatic for tomorrow night, Kate said. The reception for the Commonwealth High Commissioners. She's been making unusual arrangements, bringing in additional staff, coordinating with media outlets that aren't usually invited to such events. What kind of arrangements? We're not entirely sure, William admitted. But our sources suggest she's planning some kind of announcement or revelation that would fundamentally change the family dynamic. Charles felt panic rising in his chest. What are you suggesting we do? Kate stood and walked over to him. We're suggesting you do what you should have done years ago. Stand up to her. Tomorrow night, in front of the Commonwealth representatives and the media, we're going to expose what she's been doing, William said. But we need you with us, Father. We need you to choose the monarchy over your marriage. Charles looked at his son and daughter-in-law, seeing them clearly for perhaps the first time in months. They weren't scheming opportunists trying to commercialize their royal status. They were two young people who'd been fighting to protect not just themselves, but the institution they'd sworn to serve. What do you need me to do? He asked. Kate smiled for the first time since entering the room. We need you to trust us. And we need you to be prepared for Camilla to fight back with everything she has. She won't go quietly, William warned. When she realizes we've exposed her operation, she'll try to turn the situation around. She'll claim we're the ones plotting against the monarchy, that we're trying to force you out. Charles nodded, feeling more clear-headed than he had in days. Then, we'd better make sure we're prepared for whatever she throws at us. As William and Kate prepared to leave, Charles caught Kate's hand. Catherine, I owe you an apology. This afternoon, after meeting with Camilla, I almost believed her version of events. Kate squeezed his hand gently. That's what makes you a good man, Charles. You want to believe the best of people, even when they don't deserve it. But it also makes me a vulnerable king, Charles said. I can't let my personal feelings compromise my judgment again. After they left, Charles remained in his study, surrounded by the evidence of his wife's deception. Outside, the palace was settling into its evening routine, but Charles knew that tomorrow would bring a reckoning that would change everything. He thought about Camilla, probably in her chambers at that very moment, planning her next move. Did she suspect that her elaborate scheme was unraveling? Was she preparing contingency plans, or did she still believe she could manipulate her way out of exposure? Charles picked up his phone and called his private secretary. I need you to arrange a meeting for first thing tomorrow morning. I want to review all the arrangements for tomorrow night's reception, and I want to make some changes. What kind of changes, Your Majesty? Charles looked out at the dark gardens where he'd walked with Diana decades ago, where he'd played with his grandchildren just last summer, where he'd dreamed of a reign that would strengthen the monarchy for future generations. The kind that will remind everyone who actually wears the crown in this family, he said. The morning of the Commonwealth High Commissioner's reception dawned gray and drizzly, matching Charles's mood as he stood in his study reviewing the final arrangements. He'd been awake since 4 a.m., unable to sleep as he mentally rehearsed the confrontation that lay ahead. Today would either save the monarchy or destroy his marriage, and possibly both. His private secretary had worked through the night implementing the changes Charles had requested. The guest list had been subtly modified, the seating arrangements adjusted, and, most importantly, the media protocols had been completely revised. When Camilla realized what was happening, it would be too late for her to change course. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Your Majesty, came James's voice. Her Majesty has requested breakfast together in the morning room. Charles felt his stomach tighten. Camilla rarely suggested shared breakfasts on days when they had significant royal duties. She preferred to maintain her routine and handle correspondence during the morning hours. The fact that she was seeking his company suggested she suspected something was amiss. Tell Her Majesty I'll join her shortly, Charles said. The walk to the morning room felt longer than usual, each step carrying him closer to what might be their final meal together as husband and wife. Charles tried to steel himself for whatever performance Camilla might put on, but part of him still hoped there might be an innocent explanation for everything William and Kate had discovered. Camilla was already seated at the small table, looking elegant in a cream-colored blouse and navy cardigan. The morning papers were folded neatly beside her plate, and she looked up with a warm smile as Charles entered. Good morning, darling, she said, standing to kiss his cheek. I thought we should have a quiet moment before the chaos of today's events. Charles settled into his chair, accepting tea from the waiting footman. That's thoughtful of you. I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday morning, Camilla continued, buttering a piece of toast with careful precision. About William and Catherine's documentary project. Charles kept his expression neutral. Oh, I may have been too hasty in my concerns, Camilla said. After reflection, I think their initiative could be quite positive for the family's image, properly managed. Charles felt a chill at her words. This was exactly the kind of reversal William and Kate had warned him about. Camilla was repositioning herself as supportive and reasonable, making any accusations against her seem petty and vindictive. I'm glad you feel that way, Charles said carefully. I think they've put a great deal of thought into the project. Camilla nodded enthusiastically. Absolutely. In fact, I'd like to suggest that we offer them additional support. Perhaps we could coordinate some joint appearances, show the unity of the family. Charles realized she was trying to insert herself into William and Kate's project to regain control of the narrative by appearing collaborative rather than controlling. That's a generous offer, Charles said. Have you discussed this with them? Not yet, but I plan to speak with Catherine this afternoon before the reception. Camilla's smile was radiant. I think she'll be pleased to know she has my full support. Charles felt sick imagining how that conversation might go, with Camilla presenting herself as magnanimous while subtly undermining everything William and Kate were trying to accomplish. Camilla, Charles said, there's something I need to ask you about. Her fork paused halfway to her mouth. Of course, darling. What is it? The cottage in Gloucestershire. When were you there last? Camilla's expression didn't change, but Charles caught a flash of something, calculation, perhaps, in her eyes before she answered. Oh, weeks ago. Why do you ask? Just wondering. I was thinking of visiting sometime soon. It's such a peaceful place. Wonderful idea, Camilla said brightly. Though I should mention, I've had some work done recently. New security systems, upgraded communications. The place isn't quite as rustic as it used to be. Charles felt his heart sink. Even now, faced with a direct question, Camilla was lying to him with practiced ease. Her admission about the upgrades was essentially a confession that the cottage had been converted into the command center William and Kate had described. They finished breakfast in strained small talk, with Camilla chattering about the evening's guest list and protocol details. Charles went through the motions of paying attention, but his mind was focused on the hours ahead and the decisions that would shape the rest of his reign. After breakfast, Charles retreated to his study where William was waiting with the final preparations for the evening. They'd coordinated with palace security to ensure that all of Camilla's known operatives would be monitored throughout the reception, preventing any last-minute sabotage attempts. How did she seem this morning? William asked. Confident, Charles replied. Almost cheerful. Either she's completely unaware that we know about her activities, or she's an even better actress than we realized. Kate arrived an hour later, carrying a small recording device and several folders of evidence. She looked calm but determined, dressed in a navy dress that would photograph well for the historical significance of what was about to happen. Camilla just called, Kate announced. She wants to meet with me at 3 o'clock to discuss our shared goals for the family's future. William frowned. That's cutting it close to the reception start time. I think that's intentional, Kate said. She's planning something for tonight, and she wants to make sure I'm either on board or neutralized beforehand. Charles looked at his watch. It was already past noon, and the Commonwealth representatives would begin arriving at 7 p.m. They had less than 7 hours to execute their plan. Are you sure about this? Charles asked Kate. Meeting with her alone seems dangerous. Kate's smile was grim, but determined. I won't be alone. We'll have full audio monitoring, and security will be positioned nearby. Besides, I want to hear what she's planning directly from her. The afternoon passed in a blur of final preparations and growing tension. Charles went through his usual schedule of meetings and correspondence, but his mind was elsewhere. Every time his phone buzzed with a text or his secretary appeared with an update, he expected to hear that something had gone wrong with their plans. At 3:15, Charles received a text from Kate. Meeting with C now. Audio feed active. Wish me luck. For the next hour, Charles tried to focus on reviewing briefing papers for the evening's diplomatic conversations, but his concentration was shattered. What was Camilla saying to Kate? What final manipulation was she attempting? At 4:20, Kate returned to his study, her face pale but determined. Well, William asked immediately. Kate sank into a chair and pulled out the recording device. She's planning to announce tonight that you're stepping down due to health concerns, with her serving as regent until William is deemed ready to assume full responsibilities. Charles felt the room spin. What? She has forged medical reports suggesting cognitive decline, supposedly based on conversations with your private physician. She's also prepared statements from various palace officials expressing concern about your decision-making abilities. William stood abruptly. That's treason. It gets worse, Kate continued. She's also planning to reveal selected portions of our private conversations, taken out of context, to suggest that William and I have been pressuring you to abdicate in our favor. Charles understood now why Camilla had seemed so confident that morning. She wasn't just planning to consolidate power, she was planning to eliminate both him and his chosen successors in one decisive move. The media she's invited tonight aren't just society photographers, Kate said. She has investigative journalists, legal experts, even a constitutional law scholar standing by to provide commentary on the succession implications. Can she actually do this? Charles asked. William was already on his phone with the palace's legal team. After a brief conversation, he turned back to his father with a grim expression. Theoretically, if there were genuine medical concerns and broad institutional support, a regency could be established. But it would require parliamentary approval and formal medical certification, which she thinks she can provide, Kate said. She's been very thorough in her preparations. Charles felt a curious sense of calm settling over him. After months of doubt and manipulation, the situation had finally become clear. Camilla had overplayed her hand, revealing the full extent of her ambition. Now he knew exactly what he needed to do. Change of plans, he announced. We're not waiting for the reception to expose her. We're doing it now. Charles picked up his phone and called his private secretary. I need you to arrange an emergency meeting in the throne room immediately. I want all senior palace officials, the heads of security, and representatives from the Prime Minister's office present within the hour. What about Camilla? William asked. She'll be invited, of course, as will all of her known associates on the palace staff. Charles's voice was steadier than it had been in weeks. It's time to remind everyone who actually rules this monarchy. The next 2 hours were a whirlwind of activity as the hastily arranged meeting came together. Charles used the time to review all the evidence William and Kate had gathered, preparing himself for the most important speech of his reign. At 6 p.m., Charles entered the throne room to find it packed with the most senior members of the royal household. Camilla sat in the front row, looking elegant and composed, but Charles caught her glancing repeatedly at the exits as if calculating escape routes. Charles took his position on the throne, the weight of the crown jewels he wore emphasizing the gravity of the moment. The room fell silent as everyone recognized that something historic was about to happen. Ladies and gentlemen, Charles began, his voice carrying clearly through the ornate space. I have called you here to address a matter of the utmost importance to the security and integrity of this monarchy. He gestured to William and Kate, who stood at his right side. Over the past weeks, my son and daughter-in-law have brought to my attention evidence of a systematic campaign to undermine the legitimate authority of the crown and manipulate the succession process. Charles saw Camilla's face go white, but she maintained her composure as he continued. This campaign has involved forged documents, fabricated evidence, illegal surveillance of royal family members, and the corruption of palace staff members who swore oaths of loyalty to the crown. The room was dead silent as Charles laid out the evidence methodically. Financial records showing payments to journalists, copies of forged emails, and medical reports, recordings of